Most people dream of spending their old age surrounded by their children, enjoying the comforts of family life, right? However, what many fail to realize is that this choice can be one of the biggest mistakes you can make in your senior years. Yes, living near your children may seem like the most obvious decision, but there is a dark side that few mention. Emotional dependency, overwhelming responsibilities, and the loss of your freedom are just some of the hidden traps in this choice. Do you want to age with balanced mental health? Do you want to maintain your quality of life and mobility? Then it's time to reassess this common notion and understand how to ensure your independence without sacrificing family love. In this video, you will discover how to avoid this trap and learn the secrets to healthy aging without becoming just another victim of the grandmother slave syndrome. Mrs. Smith, at 70 years old, saw her life change dramatically with the loss of her husband. She then decided to follow the dream of many seniors, to live with her daughter Lucy, surrounded by love and family companionship. She imagined her days would be filled with the laughter of grandchildren and human warmth, believing that healthy aging would be easier alongside her loved ones. For her, it seemed like an opportunity to enjoy her golden years with emotional well-being and quality of life. However, like many people her age, she didn't foresee the challenges ahead. At first, Mrs. Smith's days in Lucy's house were exactly as she had dreamed. She felt useful helping with the children, and being involved in the family routine seemed like a blessing. However, over time, what was supposed to be a phase of peace and emotional recovery turned into a draining routine. The weight of responsibilities began to overwhelm her mental health, something many grandparents experience when they take on a caregiver role. The lack of freedom and constant family demands robbed her of the opportunity to age with quality of life, something so fundamental to well-being at that stage. What Mrs. Smith didn't yet know was that this situation, so common in families around the world, was slowly draining her energy and her ability to live independently. Mental health in old age is often neglected when it is assumed that being with family is the best scenario. However, the pressure she felt began to weigh heavily on her. The dream of an active and mobile old age, something that should be natural, transformed into a routine that sapped her strength without her realizing how it was affecting her well-being. Months passed, and Mrs. Smith began to notice that her daily routine was becoming more exhausting than enjoyable. Caring for her grandchildren, managing the household, and being a constant support for Lucy had ceased to be comforting activities and started to consume her physical and emotional energy. What initially seemed like a way to stay active was now robbing her of her independence and freedom. The absence of moments for herself began to take a toll on her mental health, and the desire for healthy aging and vitality felt increasingly out of reach. She started to feel the effects of emotional and physical overload. The lack of time to dedicate to hobbies, meet friends, or even relax alone became glaringly evident. The pressure to be constantly available for the family directly impacted her emotional well-being. This constant strain not only affected her quality of life, but also made Mrs. Smith question whether this was truly the life she envisioned for her old age. The promise of living near family, which once seemed synonymous with happiness, was turning into a cycle of exhaustion. As she observed the signs of fatigue accumulating, she realized that something needed to change. Mrs. Smith missed her old routine, where she had more autonomy and freedom to make her own choices. Her mind, which had once been filled with dreams and hopes, now felt burdened by family demands. Old age, a time that should be marked by tranquility and personal growth, was instead characterized by a sense of entrapment. But Mrs. Smith still didn't know that this was just a transition phase, and a new discovery awaited her. Like many women in their senior years, Mrs. Smith began to feel the weight of a condition that, although common, is seldom discussed: the grandmother slave syndrome. This syndrome affects grandmothers who, overwhelmed by excessive family responsibilities, neglect their own well-being, emotional health, and mental stability. Over time, the daily demands of caring for her grandchildren and keeping the house in order became a burden, and the feeling of exhaustion grew silently. Mrs. Smith, once active and full of energy, now found herself overwhelmed, without recognition or space to care for herself. Unfortunately, this syndrome affects many grandmothers who, unknowingly, dedicate so much of their time and effort to family responsibilities that their own lives take a backseat. The idea of aging with quality of life and balanced mental health becomes distant, especially when the feeling of being indispensable takes hold. It is not uncommon for these women to feel trapped in a routine that no longer belongs to them. In Mrs. Smith's case, the realization that she was living for others began to erode her emotional well-being and her desire for an active and healthy old age. This scenario was compounded by a lack of emotional support and recognition. The absence of dialogue about the challenges she faced, both with her daughter and other family members, contributed to this feeling of being overwhelmed. Like many grandmothers, Mrs. Smith felt her independence had been traded for a series of obligations. The excessive caregiving prevented her from attending to her own mental health. However, something within her still longed for change, and this desire to reclaim her freedom was about to emerge in an unexpected way. The turning point in Mrs. Smith's life began with a casual conversation with her friend Carla, also in her senior years, but living a completely different reality. Carla, after going through a similar situation, had decided to live alone, reclaiming her independence and dedicating herself to hobbies she always loved. Carla's example was a wake-up call for Mrs. Smith, who began to reflect on her own life. She realized that to restore her emotional well-being and mental health, it was essential to make decisions that prioritized her own happiness. Carla's story of overcoming challenges became the catalyst for Mrs. Smith to reconsider her situation. Inspired by her friend's experience, Mrs. Smith decided to make a change. She recognized that the only way to live a healthy and balanced old age was to regain her freedom, both physically and emotionally. With the understanding that her happiness depended on more autonomy, she talked to her daughter Lucy, explaining the importance of reclaiming her own identity. Mrs. Smith decided to move out and seek a space where she could live independently, rediscovering activities she hadn't practiced for years, such as reading, gardening, and meeting friends. Mrs. Smith's life began to revolve around taking care of her mental and emotional health, prioritizing her quality of life. This rebirth, however, was not just physical. She started to explore a new perspective on life, one that was more focused on her well-being and the pursuit of an active old age. She realized that by taking care of herself, she could contribute even more to her family without sacrificing her independence. The change was gradual but transformative. Carla's story not only inspired Mrs. Smith to make this transition, but also demonstrated that it is possible to age gracefully and with strength, without giving up mobility and freedom. Now, Mrs. Smith had the opportunity to live her old age as she had always wished. Mrs. Smith discovered that balance was the key to living her later years with emotional well-being and mental health. Living alone, she was finally able to establish a routine that provided her with peace and freedom, while still maintaining contact with her family. She understood that preserving her independence did not mean distancing herself from her children and grandchildren, but rather valuing the space she needed for herself. This balance brought her a new perspective on life, where caring for her emotional health was just as important as the emotional support she could offer to others. A clear example of this was her decision to dedicate certain days of the week solely to herself, while reserving special moments with her family on other days. The impact of this change was immediate. Mrs. Smith began to feel lighter, and her relationship with Lucy and her grandchildren grew stronger. The independence she regained not only brought her more happiness, but also improved the family atmosphere. By learning to set healthy boundaries, Mrs. Smith avoided the emotional exhaustion that had previously affected her deeply. She understood that interdependence, when well-balanced, strengthens family ties without the need for sacrifices that harm anyone's well-being. This equilibrium directly reflected in the quality of life for everyone around her. This new phase in her life brought important lessons for those seeking to live well in their later years. By taking back control of her life, Mrs. Smith demonstrated that it is possible to age with mental health and balance, and that personal freedom is essential for an active life. By caring for herself, she inspired others around her to seek the same path. The motivation that now guided her life was based on a modern Viking stoicism, where inner strength and the ability to overcome challenges were the true compass. Mrs. Smith finally understood that by living with balance, she could move forward with serenity and courage. Now that you've learned the secrets to maintaining your independence and emotional well-being in your later years, it's time to reflect. How are you taking care of your mental health? Are you, like Mrs. Smith, sacrificing your freedom in the name of responsibilities that you shouldn't have to carry? Remember, aging with quality of life is possible, but it requires you to make conscious choices. What will be the next step to reclaim your freedom? How can you balance your family relationships without losing yourself in the process? If these questions resonate with you, it's a sign that it's time for change. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications to continue learning how to live your later years to the fullest. And don't forget to watch the next video. Put your name in salt water to harness Viking stoic strength and resilience. There, you will discover how to draw inspiration from the strength and wisdom of the Vikings to face challenges with resilience and courage.